Welcome to Planet People, a podcast that aims to inspire curiosity and cultivate a deeper connection with the natural world. I'm Natalie Jane, a conservation biologist, eco-communicator, and the host of this podcast series. And I am thrilled to be sharing stories with you that highlight the beauty and importance of protecting our planet's wildlife.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Planet People. I am so excited to have Nicole Schriber aboard this episode as she dives into her experience about being a naturalist and a student studying marine biology at UCSD. She shares her enthusiasm for orcas aboard many whale watching boats here in San Diego and Alaska. Nicole, welcome to the episode.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm so excited to be here and talk about my favorite thing in the world, killer whales. So yeah, like Natalie said, I am a marine biology student at UC San Diego, and I love orcas, maybe a little bit too much. I work here in San Diego aboard Gone Whale Watching San Diego, which is a small boat whale watching company where I've had amazing encounters with so many different whales, but recently a strange pod of Eastern tropical Pacific killer whales that have been making headlines. So I'm a naturalist there, and that involves basically just talking one-on-one to people, telling them about the nature, the animals specifically, answering questions, just sharing my love of the animals. And then in the summer, I go all the way up to Alaska. I work with some other whales and glaciers. I work with Talon Marine Tours up there in Yakutat Bay, doing tours of Hubbard Glacier. So same thing, just on a larger scale with a microphone, talking to the whole boat, and then, of course, still answering individual questions. I absolutely love it. I love just getting to share my passion with everyone. That is my favorite thing about being in this field.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Nicole. I can feel your passion through the screen, and that's really why we're having you on the episode today to share your story and your passion of teaching people about orcas and other marine life you see out there on these cool whale watching tours you get to lead. And speaking of orcas, there's been such a frenzy of orcas appearing in the Southern California waters, which is pretty unusual from what I hear that, they're not commonly seen on our coastline. What has it been like having these up close and personal experiences with orcas? If you want to share about, the type of pod, I know you said it's the Eastern tropical Pacific killer whales, right?
Yeah,
Cool.
it's been an absolute dream come true. Everyone has bucket list species. Well, orcas, there are so many different kinds that you have bucket list ecotypes and pods and everything like that. And the ETPs were definitely that for me. Normally, when people ask me, do you see orcas here in San Diego? I just tell them no, because that's how rare it is. It's a really once in a blue moon thing, sometimes once or twice a year. We've gone years without seeing them at all. And then all of a sudden, they just showed up and they stuck around for so long. So it started in October. I was actually getting ready for class, sitting down, and I get a call from the owner of Gone Whale Watching, Dominic, and he says, "Cool, what are you doing right now?" I'm like, "Well, I have school." It's like, "How important is this class?" So that depends entirely on what you're about to tell me. He says, "How would you like to go hang out with some ETPs?" I drop everything. I race over to the harbor, and we go out and we spend the evening with a group of 10 Eastern tropical Pacific killer whales. We saw them hunt an inshore bottlenose dolphin, and then just kind of hang out and socialize until the sunset, and we had to go home. And I was already like satisfied, like, okay, I'll die happy now. And then in December, they show up again. We're like, oh my goodness, they stuck around for so long. This is so amazing. We go out, we see them again. We have a couple great encounters with them in December, and we keep thinking, all right, there's no way they're still going to be here next week. And then they were here. And they didn't leave. Let's see, our last encounter was at the very end of January, and they have not been seen since. So we do think they've gone back to Mexico now, but the amount of time they've spent in our waters is completely unprecedented. It's never been recorded having this much orca activity here in Southern California. So that has been super, super special and a really unique opportunity to study these animals that we don't know much about. Eastern tropical Pacific orcas, or ETPs as they're abbreviated, are a type of orca that doesn't get studied as much in general in the tropics. Orcas are more spread out. less dense of a population, and there's also a lot less research going on. They're harder to see, so it's obviously harder to research them. So this has been really our best look at this particular group ever. So we learned a whole bunch about them in this short amount of time.
That's awesome. Why do you think these orcas were spending so much time in Southern California waters compared to previous years where maybe they weren't seen at all? Is it some source of prey availability, or why are they migrating up here? Do you know?
You know, we'll never be able to say for sure, but I think
Mhm.
prey is a big part of it. So they're eating, we've seen them predating on mostly dolphins, common dolphins and bottlenose dolphins, with 2 hunts on gray whales, one successful, one not.
Oh, wow. That's
And
interesting.
yeah, the dolphins here, I mean, orcas are so rare here that the dolphins, they've never seen an orca before in their life. They don't know what to be afraid. They don't know what this thing is.
Sure.
So we're guessing that they're probably just really easy pickings. And we have such an abundance of them here that the whales probably just came in here and realized this is an all you can eat buffet and we'll hang out here. Another reason they might be more comfortable spending more time in our waters is the El Nino that we're having right now. In essence, that basically means that our waters are warmer than usual, and we also get a lot more rain than usual. I'm not going to explain the ocean physics. Natalie explained that really well in a previous episode, so go listen.
Thank you.
But our waters are warmer here, so maybe since they're more used to warmer waters down in Mexico, it might be a bit more comfortable for them. But I also think that they'd probably be fine with our normal waters. So it's a thought, but
Fascinating.
I'm really not sure. It could be a combination of all that. Could just be for some reason the matriarchs are like, yeah, we'll vacation here for a while. Whatever. Good eating.
That's awesome. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good guess considering they do tend to stay in those warmer waters down in Mexico. And like you said, with this El Nino event, we're having warmer ocean climates than usual this year for sure. You mentioned matriarchs. Are the matriarchs the one that lead the pod north or south, depending on where they want to migrate? Is there one matriarch, or how does that social structure work within this ETP pod?
Yeah, so killer whales are a matriarchal society, which means they are led by a female. She's much smaller than the males, but she is in charge. It's all about that attitude. And typically, the oldest female is the matriarch, and she has a lot of experience from her many years of life. Female killer whales live an average of around 50 years. So she has a lot of experience. She knows what she's doing, and she will lead the whales where they need to go, what they need to do, when they need to do it. So she is in charge.
That's pretty badass that the matriarch leads the way and that she has so much experience and knowledge to pass off to the rest of the pod, and she leads the way, right? That's sort of like this podcast. The women on this podcast are leading the way, and
Absolutely.
I think women in conservation in general take a really strong leadership role. So it's kind of cool to see parallels between females across all different mammal species, humans, mammals alike.
Absolutely. And then the rest of the social structure depends a lot on what kind of orchid you're looking at. Residents have a really close knit family structure. They will stay with their pods for life generally. So the matriarch gives birth to someone. If that someone is a son, he'll stay with her for the rest of his life. If that someone is a daughter, she'll give birth to another baby who will stay with that pod for the rest of their life, so on and so forth. Fathers are from outside the pod. They don't have any involvement after mating. So it's just the one matriarch and her matriline, which is what's called all of her descendants. And then in other whales, it tends to be a bit more fluid. Like with transients, we tend to see much smaller pod sizes, so they'll break off from each other a lot more frequently. You know, smaller sizes makes it easier to sneak around and hunt things. So some other killer whales do have more of a fluid social structure, like, for example, transients. They tend to have smaller pods, which makes it easier to sneak around and hunt marine mammals. So they will break off into separate groups when their pod gets a bit too big. So one of the older females will take her offspring and they'll start their own new little pod. But even when that happens, there tends to be family reunions. The 2 pods will come together and spend time together. It's not super unusual comparatively to see solitary male transient killer whales. I've seen quite a few of them, really. It's still not common, but we see that with some regularity in transients compared to residents. With the
Interesting.
ETPs, we don't really know yet. Again, there needs to be a lot more studying done on them to figure out kind of what their social structure is. We assume they're matriarchal like the other whales, but there's not much we know past that. And throughout the world, they're all just a little bit different. But the matriarchs is something that appears to remain constant.
So, with that matriarchal social structure, you mentioned that the male usually comes from outside of the pod. Does that mean when the matriarch reproduces with a male from the outside, that the male won't tend to stick around with the rest of the family?
Correct. So, different pods will meet up with other pods to breed, and then they both go their separate ways. So, males are not involved in their offspring's life at all.
Wow, that's really quite interesting. So, the female is the leader from the start to the finish, especially if the male doesn't stick around. The whole family really only has the matriarch to look to.
Yeah, absolutely. The males are kind of the bottom of the totem pole there when it comes to the hierarchy of killer whales. Even
Wow.
the smallest female is going to be way more dominant than the largest male.
Wow, that's fascinating. And we see that in other marine mammals too. For example, the harbor seal, when females give birth to their pups, the male has already left to return and migrate. They don't stick around. For example, in La Jolla at Children's Pool, all of the males have left the building, so to speak, right? On the beach here, we see the females give birth to their pups, but by that point, none of the males are around to train their young at all.
Yeah, that's just a marine mammal thing in general. There's just no really care.
All the more reason to trust women. We're large and in charge with attitude or with size. But I guess in this case, the female orcas are smaller than male
Yeah,
orcas. Yeah,
small and in charge.
small and in
Females
charge.
they have the attitude.
We'll say that they just have the large attitude and they're in charge, even though they're
Yes.
smaller. That's so interesting because in other animals, like for example, birds of prey, like with raptors, the female is always bigger than the male, and that's true in bald eagles and other hawks or birds of prey alike. So it's just interesting to see, the differences across all animals. But thank you for sharing. So, what are some fun facts about orcas that we can share with our listeners?
Yeah, well, I've got loads, but I'll stick with a couple. First, I want to talk about orca vocalizations, orca language. Orcas are all so different from one another that if you were to listen to an orca in Antarctica, it would sound totally different than a killer whale up in the Pacific Northwest. And even to an untrained ear, you could tell they probably sound like completely different animals. But if you have a trained ear, you can look at two different pods of residents that are closely related to one another genetically, and you can just listen to them and you can tell which pod is which just based on their dialect.
Wow, that's fascinating. They have all these different types of vocalizations. So does that mean different pods have different languages then?
Kind of. I think within a population of residents, for example, they're definitely able to understand each other, but they kind of have like foreign accents, you could say, and just certain calls that are used by just one pod or another. So you can kind of, if you're listening to them vocalize, you can pick out, oh, that's this pod because they make this one call that's a little bit different than this one. And then, of course, if you're looking at residents versus transients, they're going to sound super, super different as well. For example, residents are going to be vocalizing a lot more and echolocating a lot more in general because they're hunting salmon, which aren't the smartest, don't have the best capability of hearing echolocation and getting out of there. Meanwhile, marine mammals, what the transients are hunting, they need to be very quiet when they're hunting because those marine mammals will hear them and scram. So definitely differences there. They just are all so uniquely different in their vocalizations. And that's one very helpful way of studying them is through acoustics because they're all so different.
And have you ever heard the ETPs vocalizing before?
Unfortunately, we have not. So like the transients, they're hunting marine mammals, dolphins especially. So they tend to be very, very quiet. We haven't been able to actually hear them vocalize. That's something way in the future when I have the equipment, the money, and the time, I would love to kind of study them acoustically, but not yet, unfortunately.
Well, I'm sure there will be plenty more interactions in the future for you to be able to collect that data. So, what are some other fun facts outside of the vocalizing and languages that these orcas have that you might want to share with our audience?
Well, here's one of my absolute favorites. Let me ask you, what color are killer whales?
Black and white?
No, purple and yellow.
Oh, wow. Really?
I kid you not. So obviously, yes, they're essentially black and white. But if you're looking at them in the right lighting, you'll see, I mean, nothing in nature is really pure black or pure white. And if you're looking in direct sunlight, when the light is hitting them just right, you can see the black of their backs has kind of a purplish brown sheen to it. You can only see it in just the right lighting, but it's really, really beautiful. So they have purple undertones, purplish brown, depends on the lighting. And then the white parts of them tend to have more of a warm color. So you can see generally up by their chins, you can see some residue of kind of that yellowish color. The rest of them looks pretty darn white, but if you were to drop a color eyedropper on there in Photoshop, you can generally see if the lighting is right, that it is a little bit yellow. And orca calves are actually born orange, like really, really orange. And no, we do not know exactly why that is yet. There are lots of guesses, but nobody knows exactly why, but they're orange and then they start to slowly fade out to almost completely white when they are adults. So yeah, killer whales are technically purple and yellow.
I love that because purple is the color of royalty. And as apex predators, they are royalty in my mind, and purple totally represents that. That's a pretty awesome fun
Absolutely.
fact. And even the fact that calves are born orange, I like that too, because orange represents the color of creativity and curiosity. And based on all of your stories, it sounds like all of these orcas have been very curious, whether or not, that's how we perceive it. That's pretty cool.
And you want to know what else killer whales are born with?
Tell me,
Hair.
is that right?
So, yes, so they are mammals just like us. And they do have hair, although it falls out very shortly after birth. It's only a few little hairs. It's on the side of their rostrum. So the rostrum is what you generally call the nose, even though their nose is in their blowhole. So it's the front of their face. And along the sides of their rostrum, there you can see few little dots if you were to look really close at a killer whale. And that's where they used to have these little whiskers sticking out shortly after birth. And why they have them could just be vestigial. They might help them to find their mother while they're nursing. They fall out very shortly after, but they are born with a few little hairs.
Fascinating. Some really cool fun facts. Thank you for sharing, Nicole. I had no idea about the hair and then the different coloration. We might not see that through the camera or on the screen, but up close and personal, it sounds like in just the right lighting, we can get a better look at their true color.
Wow, that's really cool. It reminded me of the blue and black dress or the white and gold dress.
Yeah. That whole trend. That whole
Yeah.
trend.
Middle school flashbacks.
I know,
Yeah.
seriously. That's funny. No, that's a good example though, Coral, because so many people were like, this is actually this color, that color. Honestly, that's kind of what came to my mind when Nicole asked me that.
Yeah.
So with all of your experience aboard the Gone Whale Watching tour boats as a naturalist, you must have acquired so much photo ID knowledge for your complex photo ID study. I know that's something you mentioned that you're studying and putting together. What has that looked like, and how have you understood the differences in the ETP pod versus other pods that you've studied?
All right, so I think I'll start with an overview of the different orcas in the North Pacific, just to kind of get everyone oriented on what we're talking about. ETPs, Eastern North Pacific, what's all that? So here along the west coast of the United States, we are along the eastern edge of the Pacific Ocean basin. So that confuses everyone. This is the Eastern North Pacific, even though it's the west coast of North America. So here in the Eastern North Pacific, we have 3 recognized ecotypes of killer whales. An ecotype is kind of like a subspecies, though it's not technically, but you can think of it that way. Different diets, culture, morphology, behavior, and region all are things that'll separate ecotypes from one another. Genetics, obviously. There are 10 recognized ecotypes in the world, but that is a very shaky number. One thing you need to understand about killer whales is that taxonomically, they are a nightmare. Nobody can really agree. Lots of people think that they should be separate species instead of just one.
Interesting.
And it's a complete mess. So bearing that in mind, there are 3 ecotypes in the Eastern North Pacific. There are the residents, which are salmon specialists. They eat all fish and primarily salmon. There are transients known as Biggs killer whales, and they're the ones that are going to be eating marine mammals, although that depends which marine mammal they like to focus on, depends on where they are in the world, what pods. Sometimes they're generalists, sometimes they have a favorite. And then there are offshores, which, like their name suggests, they do tend to be further offshore. We don't know that much about them, but we do know that at least one part of their diet is sharks. And then there is the ETPs. Now, I said 3 ecotypes. The ETPs are a 4th. And that's because they are not technically recognized as an ecotype yet, although basically everyone I've ever talked to agrees that they should be considered their own ecotype because they are so vastly different from the others. So up in Alaska, we see residents and transients most often. Offshores are seen there, but I've never been lucky enough to see them yet. And then down here in Southern California, sometimes we'll have transients come down from the Monterey Bay area. That's where the California transient population tends to hang out. So I haven't seen them down in Southern California, but they will wander down occasionally. And then the Eastern Tropical Pacific orcas will occasionally wander up from Mexico. So Eastern Tropical Pacific, they live in the Eastern Pacific near the tropics. So that's going to be Mexico. If you see a killer whale in Hawaii, that's going to be an ETP. And they're very poorly understood overall. There are probably so many differences in all the different pods that we see there, and we just don't know. Killer whales tend to be highly concentrated towards higher latitudes and less in lower latitudes, and that has to do with the productivity of the ocean there. Colder, high latitude waters are more productive, so they can sustain a greater biomass of killer whales than other top predators, and less so in the lower tropical latitudes. So that's why we see less of them around here. Now, as far as the differences, we see, I told you about the different prey types that these orcas generally eat, and they also look very different. So comparing transients to these ETPs, the transients have really pointy dorsal fins. They have eye patches that slope downwards, and they have very wide saddle patches. So if you look at a picture of an orca, you can see the saddle patch is that gray area right behind the dorsal fin. With transients, that extends pretty wide. And with ETPs, it's so faint that in some lighting, you can't see it at all. And then in residence, it's still very visible. It's just a little bit narrower. And these are all things that we can look at and see, that looks like an ETP, that looks like a resident, that looks like a transient. And you can kind of tell just because of the long genetic differentiation that we have there between them. So they are pretty easy to tell apart. Another thing about ETPs that it's basically a dead giveaway is they will have pseudo-stalked barnacles along the trailing edge of their pectoral flippers, their dorsal fins, and their tail flukes. So if you look at a picture of an orca in the tropics, you might see these weird little stringy things globbed onto their dorsal fins. Those are pseudo-stalked barnacles. They're just little hitchhikers. They don't appear to pose any issue to the orcas. They just like to hang out there because they have a lot of water flow in those areas, so they can filter feed there. So they're usually globbed onto those orcas there.
Fascinating. While you've been aboard the Gone Whale Watching tour ship, have you been able to capture these differences for the ETP, and how has that helped you form your photo ID book?
So these ETPs haven't really been studied before because they're seen so rarely. They haven't been formally cataloged or documented. So that was basically part of what I was doing while we were having these encounters, is getting as many pictures as I could of them to create a photo identification guidebook so that anyone can look at a picture of any of these whales and tell, oh, this is this individual, that individual. We can track them, kind of figure out familial relationships. So I was doing that. Other people on the Gone Whale Watching team were helping with that. And then also our colleagues up at Newport Coastal Adventures, Pacific Offshore, they were also very helpful getting pictures for the ID book.
That's awesome that you've been able to collaborate with so many different groups and bring together all this data for one ID book for everyone to better understand. I mean, what better goal and like dream of a naturalist than to put together a book for your audience and your guests to understand and learn with you?
Yeah, it's really been exciting being on the forefront of the research for this particular group of whales.
That's awesome. Well, your Instagram is certainly one to keep up with, Nicole. I actually found you because of your incredible photography of these magnificent creatures. Is your photo ID guide what originally got you into photography? For our listeners, can you tell us what kind of equipment you are using?
Well, thank you. yeah, I really love photography. I got into it initially because, well, research. The most important tool you can have when researching killer whales is a camera. Getting that photo ID data, tracking individuals, it's all done with a camera. So, it kind of starts with that. And then obviously it's fun. You want to get good pictures of the animals too, just for fun and have amazing memories captured. So that's what got me into it. It's definitely been a learning curve. There are some serious challenges to taking pictures of marine wildlife. It's very different from anything on land, but I really enjoy it. For most of my pictures, I used a Canon 6D. I recently upgraded to a Canon 5D Mark IV. But if you are just beginning with photography, I do recommend the Canon 6D. It's a really, really good camera. And then I would also recommend getting a telephoto lens. I use a Sigma 50 to 500 millimeter lens. It's very old, but it still works. It has incredible range, great for whale watching. I would recommend your first lens to be at least 400 millimeters of zoom out on the water. More would be better. Talk to me on Instagram. I'd love to give you more tips on the photography. It's something I really love learning how to do more and sharing with other people.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. I'm definitely interested in learning more about wildlife photography. It's a great way to capture that storytelling element and put a face to the name of these orcas that you have been able to spend so much time studying.
And I always get the question, how in the world can you tell them apart from one another? And once you've spent enough time with a group of whales, it's like, well, how do you tell people apart? They all just look different. But when you're first
Right.
learning to identify them, there are a few features that you can look at. So first is their dorsal fin. A lot of whales have nicks in their dorsal, little cutouts that can easily be matched. Different. All right, that one has a nick there, that one nick there, big chunk there. Oh yeah, we saw that whale before. If you look at their saddle patch, which again is that gray area behind the dorsal fin, with the ETPs, that's a little tricky because they have a very, very faint one. But with other orcas, you can see they have a lot of scarring usually in those saddle patches that kind of act like tattoos, basically, to help us track them.
For an identification purpose.
Yeah. And then you can also look at their eye patches. Each eye patch is unique as a human fingerprint. So if you get a picture of that, that is the best way to identify an orca. And that's what I focus on mostly is dorsal saddle and then eye patches.
Is there one specific individual that you were able to see multiple times in your encounters with the orcas?
So interestingly, we saw all 10 individuals in every encounter. So we were able
Oh,
to, over
wow.
multiple, we were saying, all right, we have these 10 whales, 10 separate whales, and they're being seen together in basically every encounter that we're seeing. We're not seeing any other individuals. So it's just this pod of 10. And the pod tends to split up into two subgroups of 5. They will mix and match, but generally they seem to have this clear divide. So probably one of the matriarchs, whoever she is, one of her eldest daughters is probably in the process of maybe breaking away from the main pod and kind of leading her own family, but they're still tightly close together. They haven't quite made that separation yet.
That's so cool. That's so cool. I mean, the fact that you were able to go out on this boat and continuously see these same 10 whales time and time again, I feel like that allowed you to really understand this group of ETPs from, a specialized perspective because of the reoccurrence of this same group of 10 animals each time. Again, I'm sure you probably have so much cool footage, and the data for your photo ID book must be quite robust.
Yeah, it's been really helpful being able to have all these encounters with these same individuals. And, when you get enough encounters with a pod of whales, you really start to understand even their individual personalities. And I'm
What
just
is
so
that
grateful that I have the
like?
opportunity to know them.
That's so
It's
great.
amazing. You have just this deep connection with these animals. You can't speak to them, but you can still kind of communicate in a way. We have some of the whales that are really curious and they'll tend to come up to the boats. Like one young male terso, he's basically always coming over to investigate boats, and all the footage I see, yep, that's him coming to check people out. There's
Oh,
one
wow.
girl, Callie. If you see a killer whale in this pod breaching or spy hopping, it's almost always Callie. She just loves to be the center of attention, it seems like. She's very floppy. And then one of the
That's
other
so
young males,
funny.
Diego, he absolutely loves to ride in the wake of boats. this pod is really interesting because most killer whales do not care about boats at all, but this pod will actively seek out riding in the wake of a boat. And obviously, you should be careful if you're ever in a situation where you are with these killer whales for whatever reason and you try to get them to wake ride. I would suggest against that because it's something that could potentially injure these animals. So you need to be really, really careful when they're soliciting this behavior to make sure it's safe for them. But once you get going with that, it is absolutely a blast just having them following behind you and just having the time of their lives.
I mean, what a dream come true this experience is. I can just feel your emotion through the screen and how exciting it is that you've gotten to like understand these, not just the 10 individuals, but on a personal name basis. And I love that you have names attached to these different species because that can really allow our listeners to follow along and understand the story of these individuals rather than objectifying them with a number. For example, a lot of data collection in science is very number based, and that's great for, for analytical purposes. But when you get to tell a story like we are on Planet People, and the story of Diego who likes to come up to the boat or ride the wake. Just the charisma of these animals is so fascinating and curious. And I think it should spark a curiosity in each of us. If these animals, they're here to check you out in the same way that we are checking them out, right? It's like a
Yeah,
mutual
absolutely.
respect.
I really like putting names to all of the whales. They do have numbers, obviously. That's important for kind of keeping track of them in data and everything. But I always like to have them have names. First of all, it's a lot easier for me to remember names than it is numbers. So if I don't want to be checking the ID guide every time we see them, they need names. And also,
Sure.
it just allows people to connect a lot better.
Definitely.
A name is so much more personal than a number.
Did you give them their names or was it kind of a group effort?
It was a group effort. So a lot of us, just all the teams that we were working on this, people just kind of supplied different names and then everyone kind of picked what they liked best.
That's cool.
I did get to name Callie was the one that I got to name. And
That's
then
so
other
fun.
members of the team and over at Pacific Offshore came up with the other names.
How did you decide on Callie?
Well, when I first met her, I was calling her Miss K because I just needed something to call her, and the K stood for killer because she's a killer whale, and she was punting dolphins 20 feet in the air.
Oh my gosh. Are you serious?
Yeah, maybe 20 feet's an exaggeration, but they definitely do that sometimes. I'm
You
not
saw
sure I've
that?
seen that.
You saw her punt dolphins?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe she didn't quite reach 20 feet, but she punted that thing.
That's crazy. What was your reaction when you saw that? Like mind blown?
Yeah, exactly. Just speechless. Oh my gosh, what?
That's so cool.
But anyways, yeah, so just for something to call her in the meantime, I call her Miss K. So then I figured, well, her name has to start with a K. I'm just kind of running through things in my head. Cali, like California, but with a K. Whatever, we'll go with that. I just think it's pretty.
Cute. I love that even more that it has an association with California, but with a K for killer whale. Perfect. That's great. I love that story. Thank you for sharing. It's really the storytelling aspect of this podcast and having passionate guests on like you that just get me excited and passionate. And I know it inspires our listeners too. So thank you so much for sharing. That's so fascinating. What else were you seeing? I mean, you saw them punting dolphins, riding in the wakes. Like, did you see them hunt the gray whale? I know you said they had one successful gray whale hunt, right?
Yeah, so I unfortunately was not on board for either of the gray whale hunts, but other people were, and they were able to get footage and everything. So that was great. It was great having so many boats on the water just documenting this stuff. So that it was really thoroughly documented no matter who was on the water. But one predation, they went after a gray whale mother and calf, and they did successfully kill the calf. Then they harassed the mother for a while, but she got away. And then later they went after another adult or subadult gray whale, and they harassed that one for, it was a few hours, I think.
Wow.
And eventually just let it go.
I mean, that is truly a National Geographic moment. And hearing about this and seeing it in, the LA Times and all the social media footage around it was exciting. I mean, I had tried to go out and see them from La Jolla Cove when they were here Christmas Day. Came back into town the day after and I had just missed them by a day. But next time, I'm really happy that you got to see them and that your data collection has been such a robust process. And even beyond the data, it's just the stories and memories, you'll keep them near and dear to your heart, I'm sure.
Absolutely. It's been completely life-changing.
So cool. Wow. Well, it's really fascinating that you got to experience the ETP pod right here in Southern California for those few months that that group of pods were around Southern California. I know they haven't been seen for the last month, but maybe they'll return. In the meantime, I know you go up to Alaska in the summer. What kind of killer whales are you seeing up there, and the different pods and differences between the ETP and the pods up there? I know you talked about the resident and transient pods and offshore as well. If you want to share the differences that you see in behavior or identification process and what that looks like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as the identification process, it's exactly the same. Really, you're just looking at the dorsal fins, the saddle patches, the eye patches, and the shape of their face. Really, they all have different face shapes. Once you get to know them, they just all look so incredibly different.
Oh,
But when
wow.
it comes to the actual scientific photo ID, yeah, eye patches, dorsal, saddle.
Okay, so that's pretty
And
standard across every single pod.
yeah, that is
Okay.
just the classic way to do it. That's the easiest way to do it, especially the dorsal fin and the saddle patch, because that's the first thing that comes out of the water and it's the last thing that goes back down. So that tends to be easier as far as getting those ID shots. And a lot of people don't actually use the eye patches. That's something that I'm working on trying to get incorporated
Oh, really?
into a lot of ID guides.
That's interesting.
So as far as behavior goes, the residents and transients are different in their own right, but both groups compare to those ETPs. They're so sedate almost. They're just calm, and these ETPs are just all over the place. They are playing with you, punting dolphins, just they're like energetic children compared to the calm older adults. Even the babies, even a baby resident killer whale seems to have half the energy of an adult ETP. It's amazing.
And you see that up in Alaska?
Yeah, so we see the residents and the transients up there. Um, so we have two different types of transients and a bunch of different types of residents there. So we have the Gulf of Alaska transients, which are a population. They range basically most of Alaska. They're kind of the more widespread, diverse group. There's also the AT1 transients, which are unfortunately a functionally extinct population of transients. They were completely decimated by the Exxon Valdez oil spill,
Oh
and they only
my.
have 6 whales left in the pod, and all the females are past reproductive age. So
Oh
unfortunately,
no.
we are going to lose them, but for now we still have them. I've been lucky enough to meet several members of that pod.
And what does it mean to go functionally extinct for our listeners who may not know what that term is?
Yeah, so these whales are going to be extinct. There is no chance of them recovering. So we call that functionally extinct, when they're not extinct yet because they're still alive, but they are 100% destined to be extinct.
They
It's
have no way of reproducing and sustaining that local population,
right.
essentially, right?
And then also some different residents. So all the different pods of residents, they're all different, all of their own unique cultures and dialects and all that. There's a few pods that live down in Southeast Alaska, and many pods that kind of frequent the South Central Alaska area.
Wow.
So I've gotten to hang out with all of them. They're all just really unique. In Yakutat Bay, where I am right now, that's an area that's kind of almost a dead zone of cetacean research.
Why is it a dead zone?
Yeah, the researchers down in Southeast Alaska, they do most of Southeast. The researchers in South Central do most of South Central, but Yakutat Bay is right between the two. And it's kind of the middle of nowhere. So nobody really goes out there. There's no whale watching tours that run there. It's just us with our glacier tours, and everyone else there is just doing fishing. So we really don't have any data on the whales that come in there. So this is the first time, I saw a whale there. I look at the IDs trying to figure out who this is. Oh my goodness, this whale hasn't been seen for over a decade. And then that happened again. So all the transients that we've seen there have been super rare ones, for lack of a better term. So that's been really exciting to confirm they're still alive, get updated ID photos,
Oh,
figure out,
wow.
no, this is where they've been.
You're really on the forefront of acquiring so much knowledge for species that haven't been well documented or haven't been seen in a decade. That's pretty fascinating. So when you're running these tours through Yakutat Bay, it's not necessarily a whale watching tour, it's to go look for glaciers.
Yes. So the
Okay.
tour is with cruise ship companies. We go to Hubbard Glacier. Um, it's like a 2 to 2.5 hour tour over by the actual glacier face. But to get to the tour area, we have to go back and forth from the actual little town of Yakutat. And that's about 30 nautical miles. And so once in a while, we will come across whales there. So we haven't actually seen any whales with the passengers, but when we're just on our own, sometimes we'll come across them, and that's a good
Oh,
opportunity
okay.
to get some pictures.
Okay, cool. So you kind of have a different role then here in San Diego and Alaska as a naturalist. Sort of, in Alaska, it doesn't sound like you're necessarily taking the passengers to look for whales, but if you come across them, then it's useful for your own personal data collection.
Correct.
Cool. Well, man, your stories are awesome. I mean, I would love to go on a glacier tour. I'm fascinated with Alaska. I've never been, but that's also amazing that you got to see a, was it one species or a full pod of whales that weren't seen in over a decade? Or sorry, one individual?
Multiple individuals
Okay.
that I know of, at least two that haven't been seen in over a decade, and then a few others that haven't been at least formally documented in quite a few years.
Okay. And so when you come across these whales sort of by accident, are you submitting this data to like a larger database for other scientists to learn about or other people to know that, these individuals are still alive and well, or what does that next step look like?
Yeah, so the next step is I'll edit the photos and make them nice, just like you'd want in a photo ID guide. And then I send that over with all the details of the encounter to, well, when I'm in Alaska, I send that to the North Gulf Oceanic Society, who manages the killer whale research in that area. So I'll email it to them. They'll have that knowledge. You also, what I do, and I recommend everyone else do this as well, if you see a whale and get a picture of it, is submit it to happywhale.com, which is basically like a gigantic whale database. It started with humpback whales, but now it's expanded to so many other species. And it's a really useful tool that we're using to keep track of all these sightings and individuals.
Happywhale.com. That is definitely something we will add in the show notes. For anyone who does go out whale watching, they can submit their own data. It seems like kind of like a citizen science effort.
Exactly, yeah. And it's super, super useful.
So I wanted to jump back to San Diego. You mentioned that this data collection process has been very collaborative across different, whale watching tour guides and boats. How does that look like on the water with all of these boats coming to observe orcas in Southern California? Are they respectful of these pods? Because I remember seeing something out of Dana Point where there were tons of, inexperienced boaters going really close to the pods. And is there a respect guideline that people can follow?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there has been quite a few issues, especially up by Dana Point, and it seems like there's just more private boaters up there, of people just not really respecting the animals and there just being way too many boats on them at one time. And when we're there, we try, and I mean, we don't really have any authority, but we'll try on the radio, like, hey guys, let's do this, let's do this. They're in travel mode, so we're going to make this formation here. And a lot of people are pretty good at listening to that and changing their behavior.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of people are understanding. They just don't really know how to act around these whales, especially just private boaters. The whale watch companies are generally allowed how to follow kind of the guidelines and what to do around whales, but people who aren't experienced with whale behavior, killer whale behavior in particular, they might not know that they're actually really disturbing these animals. So it's more about education, and hopefully, if they ever come back, we'll try and do more outreach about this. But all we can really do is talk on the radio and try and get people to understand exactly how they're supposed to behave.
Well, that's amazing that at least you're getting some sort of positive feedback and you can understand that maybe they just don't know the necessary pro-environmental behavior to have around whale watching experiences. And it really does come back to education. I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's one of our main pillars here at Planet People is to share with our audience about, the necessary viewing guidelines when it comes to how we behave around marine mammals, whether it's from land or on water. And we talked a lot about that in our most recent episode with the Seal Society. One of our talking points was, it's safe to be a bus length away from sea lions when you're in La Jolla Cove, for example. Would you recommend sort of that same viewing distance when you're seeing orcas in the wild, or how does that V-shaped formation look? How far are you from the orcas?
Yeah, so a bus length, it could work. If you are new to whale watching, if you're not super experienced, I would stay much farther away. I would keep your boat. I mean, I'd go at least 2 bus lengths, but I think we should start with what the overall guidelines are when you're viewing marine mammals on the water. The only true law is that you cannot harass the animals. And that can involve a lot of things, like you can't touch them, you can't swim with them, you can't try to feed them. That's all considered harassment. Trying to get too close to them, going in front of them, running them over, anything like that would constitute harassment. And there's not really any guideline past that. Some regions have a whale sense program, which kind of gives some further guidelines. We don't have that in Southern California. This isn't a whale sense area, so it's kind of up to everyone to self-police, unfortunately, and that can be a bit of an issue, especially with private boaters. So what I would recommend, if you don't know about whale behavior, if you don't have a lot of time and experience being on the water with whales, first of all, just go out with a reputable whale watching company. Even if you have your own boat, for the safety of the animals, I would highly recommend, unless you know what you're doing, to go out with a reputable whale watching company, at least for a while until you kind of know what to do. And then you can slowly start taking your own boat out and getting some of those experiences on your own.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for giving us your recommendation. Would you also recommend a way for us to access these viewing guidelines where we can all better understand how to respect these animals on the water? Or is it sort of, this vague, oh, you can't harass these animals, but what does that really mean?
Yeah, so you can look up just Marine Mammal Protection Act, United States whale watching guidelines. You can also just look up whale sense, SENSE, to see what their guidelines are. And that's a pretty good starter if you don't know much about whales.
So with all of these boats on the water observing killer whales, what kind of impact do you think that is having to individuals or an entire pod? I know lately in the media with different pods around the world, maybe not necessarily in Southern California, there have been some attacks from orcas on fishing vessels and things like that. If you want to speak to maybe why that behavior is coming about.
Yeah, so I think they are kind of 2 separate issues as far as the impacts on the whales with irresponsible whale watching practices. One of the obvious ones is that you can hit a whale. It happens, unfortunately, quite a lot. A lot of whales die from ship strikes, propeller scars we see on all sorts of whales. Killer whales are a bit more agile. They can generally get out of the way, but it does happen that killer whales are still hurt and impacted by boats. Also, it's just really annoying to them. All these boats crowded around, they're just trying to live their life, and there's just boats everywhere you look, and they surface, oops, they're next to a boat. And that can be really, really frustrating for them, I'm sure. Just trying to live their lives and being just bombarded with all these boats. And then another thing that is really, really important to consider is sound. These whales rely on sound. That's the main way that they interact with their environment. And when you have all this extra noise input, it really can overwhelm their senses, block out their communication with each other, and cause a lot of confusion. And that's an issue with basically all whales in the world. That's a big issue that we're contending with right now, is just noise that we're putting out into the ocean from our various activities like shipping, Navy sonar, even just acoustic survey of the ocean floor. It's all a really big issue. So all of those come together for possibly a dangerous experience for the whales, and if not, just a really, really bothersome one. And we don't want to do that.
I see.
And then regarding your next question about the attacks that have been happening on boats over by the Iberian Peninsula, that's a really unique case. And there's a lot of media attention, a lot of people assuming different things about this behavior and why it's happening. A lot of people think it's revenge on humans for everything they're doing in the oceans. And then a lot of people think it's just kind of a cultural trend. And that's the camp that most researchers fall into. Don't get me wrong, these animals are incredibly intelligent. They probably could figure out a complicated revenge scheme if they wanted to. But I genuinely don't think that's what's happening here. I think one of these whales figured out that this part of a boat is really fun to play with. And the other whales started joining in, and now It is just their cultural fad. We see this happen in other populations. For example, the southern resident killer whale population over in the Pacific Northwest, they at one point had a trend of just carrying salmon on their heads like hats. It just caught on, just a fad. So I think that's what's happening here. You look at the types of boats and the types of parts of the boats that the orcas are actually going after, and it seems to be pretty consistent. Just this part is really fun to mangle and rip apart. It has unfortunate consequences, but again, I don't think it's anything intentionally malicious or any kind of revenge plan. So I promise the orcas are not out to get you. They just really like messing with the keels of boats.
Well, that's pretty funny fad then. And I'm glad that you kind of referenced, that maybe it's just our own perception of what we think is happening, and that the media is probably twisting these orcas to maybe kind of look violent in a way, right? Is that sort of how you're perceiving the media coverage? Because it doesn't sound like the orcas are purposely trying to, attack humans. It's just a new fad. And like you said, they're going after a certain part and playing and being curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great headline. Orcas are attacking boats, revenge of the orcas. But realistically, we need to think of this from a non-human lens and think about other reasons that they might be doing this, just looking at the patterns and the types of boats and what part of the boat they're attacking and thinking, well, is this really a revenge plot or is this just something that's kind of fun for them? And again, we'll never really know, but that seems to be the general consensus amongst most researchers. But the media definitely is portraying them as angry, violent animals, and that's really been concerning for me. It's something I've been seeing a lot, starting with these attacks, and that has even gone on to influence people's perception of these ETPs here in San Diego. A lot of people seeing these videos and photos of them hunting the dolphins are really, really upset by that. And I have, on my videos, on other people's videos, I get comment after comment of, these are murderers, they're killers, I'm glad to see them beached, they all need to die.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm not even exaggerated. This is what I'm seeing so often. And that's really shocked me, and it's really concerning from a conservation perspective that all of a sudden people are hating these animals because they're eating other marine mammals. And it's something I'm not exactly sure what to do about other than just keeping educating people and trying to get them to love these animals. Again, most people understand that they are hunting because they need to do that to survive, because things need to eat. Shocker.
Right.
But yeah, I'm not really sure how to get through to all these people other than just explaining to them over and over again, this is nature, this is the circle of life. It's not pretty. Nobody enjoys watching another animal die. But we also have to remember that if this dolphin didn't die, this adorable baby killer whale would also die. So you have to put things in perspective. It's not, they can't just go to the grocery store. They have to hunt to eat and survive. And that does not make them evil murderers. It just makes them animals trying to survive. We can't assign human morality to these wild animals.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight on this approach to understanding wildlife, because in the wild, these animals do have to survive, and we have to take this anthropogenic lens away from how we view what they need to do in the wild, right? And I think, yeah, that morality component is really what I go back to when you talk about how people perceive these animals. It's like we have to take our own emotion out of it to understand that this is nature, this is the circle of life. And like you said, if they weren't hunting dolphins, then this baby killer whale might not survive. It's really just the circle of life. And there's a lot to really unpack. I think there's misinformation spreading online, and not enough education. And that's why I'm doing this podcast, to really showcase to people the beauty of these animals, and share your story about the enthusiasm that can come with seeing these majestic creatures and curious creatures. And um, it's it's great that you can continue to educate in the comments, and through this podcast and beyond, with your page, with the photo ID book. It's great that you can share your message. And thank you so much for sticking to your guns, because a lot of people maybe would get kind of frustrated. But time and time again, you just have to show up for the animals you love and make sure that we conserve these creatures. And I also wanted to talk to, the misinformation component. I saw on your story recently that there was an account that posted a gray whale dying from what they thought was because of an orca attack. And that didn't seem to be the case, right?
Yes. So this makes me mad. So
we love a good debate.
Back a few weeks ago, a juvenile gray whale did wash up on the shores of La Jolla, and it did pass away, unfortunately. And, that was super sad. Everyone was talking about it. And then I see this account post a video of it. And this is it's a repost account. Those ones that just take people's content and repost it. This particular one, talking to other people, sounds like they don't even really ask first. Maybe reconsider what kind of information you're getting, because in the caption of their gray whale video, they said that orcas were most likely the cause for this whale's death. And I can see why you think that. I mean, they have been around, they have been seen hunting gray whales, so that's a pretty natural conclusion. However, in this case, we don't really see any evidence of that. We know that this whale was extremely skinny, just looking at the pictures. Skinniest gray whale I've ever seen, definitely just malnutrition. We also see when these whales are attacking the gray whales, they're going after their pectoral flippers and also the edge of their tail flukes. And they're going to be biting there and leaving scratches from their teeth, which are called rake marks. We see that on all the larger whales that these orcas are going after, and none of that was present on this gray whale. So no sign of orcas at all. So I politely comment, just explaining why. I'm sure you saw my original comment. I posted it on my story. I thought it was very nice and respectful, just mentioning why it probably wasn't the orcas and what the cause could be. And then I come back and I'm blocked. So this person, for some reason, was so determined to blame orcas for this death that they tried to suppress any education in the comments, trying to explain why that wasn't true. And that is super weird to me. Like, what's your beef with orcas? But also going through the comments, the people who were reading this and believing it was true, the things they were saying about the orcas were shocking. Again, more of the same. They're messing up our waters. They need to go back to Mexico. They're destroying everything in San Diego. I hate orcas.
Oh my gosh, that's horrific.
Yeah. So these animals are being blamed for a death they didn't even cause. And that's further hurting their image, which again is a massive conservation concern.
It's fueling hatred and misinformation.
Yeah, really disappointing.
That is disappointing, but what gives me hope are conversations like this one, where we can continue to educate. And that's really just a pillar of conservation in general. We have to communicate a bigger message of these species have their own right to exist in these waters and provide their own ecosystem value. They're top predators in their environment, right? They can take on great white sharks and win, right?
Yes.
It's pretty cool. I think I recently saw a video of like a grandmother orca hunting a great white and winning. That's so badass. It's like, how can you not see that these are such badass creatures, right?
Yeah, they are the undisputed top predators of the ocean.
We love a top predator. We really do. It's so cool you got to see them punt dolphins.
Yeah, it was a humbling experience, I'll tell you that.
And it's just the circle of life. People can't get too mad about that.
Yeah, some people were commenting on a dolphin hunt video, like, what a horrible way to die, such a drawn out method, slamming into it repeatedly. What an awful way to die. This is just martyrs. And then someone below commented, which I absolutely love, what do you want them to do? Use a shotgun? Like, how else are they supposed to hunt these animals? I'm sorry it wasn't quick and easy, but the dolphins fighting back, it's not going to be easy.
I mean, what are they supposed to do? Like you said, they don't have a grocery store to go to. That would just be ridiculous. It's just the human morality of it just gets in the way of understanding the ecosystem and food chain. So Nicole, you mentioned earlier in the episode that impact of sound pollution What are some types of sound pollution that might impact orcas and other whale species in our ocean ecosystems?
Yeah, so sound pollution is actually a really big issue, and a lot of people probably haven't even heard of that. You think pollution, well, that's like plastic and physical things. But there are many other types of pollution. You can think about light pollution if you go out to watch the stars, but you're in a big city. Well, the light's completely obscuring most of them. That's an example of light pollution. And there can also be sound pollution. Sound pollution is essentially just sound that's above the ambient, normal, natural background level of sound that can be interfering with animals, especially in the marine ecosystem. Sound travels 5 times faster in water than it does in air, and that makes it a really important part of everything for all these animals that live in the ocean. In particular, toothed whales, they rely extra heavily on sound because they echolocate. So orcas are toothed whales. They're the largest member of the dolphin family. And like other toothed whales, they rely on echolocation to essentially see underwater. So what echolocation is they'll put out a sound, kind of a click usually. So they'll put out these clicks, and those sound waves will bounce off objects in the water and come back to them, and their brain is able to interpret that as essentially a 3D image of what they're seeing. And they also use sound to communicate with one another. They'll whistle to each other, kind of social calls. And this isn't just orcas. All these marine mammals have these acoustic repertoires that they're using to communicate with each other and to navigate their environment, just in different ways. And so imagine you're a whale, just having a conversation with your friend, and then this big old ship comes right on top of you, and all you can hear is that would get pretty old pretty fast. And that is happening constantly. So ship noise is a big one. All the shipping that's going on in our oceans, any boats, that's all creating noise. And then you have things like Navy sonar, and that can be incredibly disruptive. That's basically the Navy's own echolocation, only it's exceptionally loud and frequent. And then there's even things like underwater surveying, using things like fish finders, which is humans trying to replicate echolocation, but it can really interfere with the echolocation that's already happening naturally. So all of that is masking these animals' normal communication and navigation. You can think of it if you're in a really crowded restaurant and you're trying to talk to your friend, it can be nearly impossible. You kind of want to step outside to actually have that conversation where you can hear and understand each other. And in our modern ocean, whales really don't have an option to step outside because everywhere is just so absolutely full of sound that humans are adding into the environment. And it can confuse them, it can disturb them, make them leave areas where their food is possibly, make it harder for them to find food. It's a really, really big issue when you consider that sound is their main sense in the ocean.
Thank you for elaborating on all those different types of sound pollution and how it impacts echolocation between orcas and other whales alike. It's really a shame that we have caused so much disturbance to these animals under the sea. And I think what makes it difficult, maybe even for myself before I had a better understanding of these different types of sound pollution, is that you're right, it's not a physical element like plastic pollution. So maybe when it comes to people's mind, it's not as obvious because it's invisible. Sound, it doesn't show up physically. It vibrates through the water and causes this disturbance across communication for different whales alike. So what would you propose we do from a conservation standpoint to reduce sound pollution in our waters?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one because, we are so reliant on all these modes of transportation in the water. One thing, if we're switching to green energy solutions, the amount of shipping will go down drastically because coal, oil, all that kind of stuff is being shipped constantly. So you take that out of the equation, the number of ships goes way down. But more realistic in the short term, there are a few things that you can do. You can modify the shape of propellers on boats. You can talk to the Navy and advise them, like you should not be doing any of this testing, using your sonar in these critical whale habitat areas. And one really interesting thing that works super well, but hasn't been widely implemented yet, is bubbles. So say you're making an offshore drilling rig. You need to pile drive a pile down into the ocean. to start building that. Well, that's going to create a lot of noise, a lot of really disruptive noise. But what if you took a tube and you put it at the bottom, right around the pile before you drive it in, and that tube has a bunch of holes and there's just bubbles coming up from it constantly? You might not think that would actually cause any kind of change, but it really does because of some complicated physics and whatnot, the difference between qualities of air and water. It essentially traps the sound. It stops it from going out as much into the open ocean, and it's really, really effective. So that is something that I absolutely think should be explored much further. That can be a super, super cheap, easy solution that is really effective. So that's something I think that everyone should be looking into. If you have a loud thing in the ocean, you should get some bubbles.
It sounds like a very natural solution too. I mean, we're not adding anything else to try to reduce that sound. It's something that, occurs through a complicated physical process, but it does seem like more of a naturalistic solution.
Yeah, it's something that, sometimes when you're trying to solve problems, you just heap more problems and create more problems and more
Right.
problems trying to solve the old problems. But, it's just bubbles.
It's just
It's
bubbles.
just air.
It's just bubbles. That's pretty cool. Thank you for sharing those solutions. That really gives me hope for reducing these sound pollution issues that you speak of. And I always try to highlight the solutions that we can discuss on Planet People, just because conservation can seem, especially wildlife conservation, can seem a bit daunting in understanding how to reduce threats to threatened species. And because we're coming in and making this disturbance, it's not our home. We can't survive under the ocean like they can. So we really need to work and coexist with these species. It all comes back to coexistence and changing our own behavior, our own operations from a socio-ecological standpoint, right? And that's something I talk about time and time again throughout this season, and how us humans operate with the natural world and this constant feedback loop that we have where we're trying to coexist, but we're causing disturbance at the end of the day. And we need to find solutions that promote respect, really, for these animals, to conserve them, and not for our own pleasure and viewing and headlines. It's for their own right to exist because they were here before we were.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, there actually are issues of endangered orcas. As a species, they're numerous, but each ecotype and each population within those ecotypes are so unique culturally, genetically. Again, most people think that orcas should be split up into multiple different species. So if one of those populations were to go extinct, you would lose an entire lineage, an entire culture. And we're dealing with that right now with these southern resident killer whales up in the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia. They're hovering at around 75 individuals. It goes up and down, but they are very endangered. They're actually listed under the Endangered Species Act specifically. And they're essentially starving to death because of the lack of salmon, overfishing, and especially dams in the rivers that they would use normally to spawn in. Those dams are blocking their spawning grounds. And so there's been a significant reduction in Chinook salmon, which comprises about 80% of the southern residents' diet. So we're seeing huge impacts from that, and we are working very hard to save these whales, but they're of a significant amount of concern right now.
So, Nicole, you mentioned the Endangered Species Act and how certain pods, like the southern resident orcas, are actually listed under the ESA. Is this true for all orcas? Is the Endangered Species Act just covering certain pods of orcas?
Yeah, so it's a little tricky. Again, they're all listed technically as one species, but not all orcas are under the Endangered Species Act.
Right, that's where I was a little confused.
It's just this southern resident population. There's 3 pods in this population, and they're the ones that are really struggling. So they specifically are considered an endangered species, even though they're part of a larger species. And then orcas as a collective are listed as data deficient, just because there are so many different kinds, and there's so much we don't know about them. So you really have to go on an individual population basis, not based on the species.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for clarifying that. And when you speak of the 75 individuals in the southern orca residents, are those broken up into 3 pods then?
Yeah, so there's J, K, and L pod. And so there's 3 pods, and again, it hovers around 75 individuals. I'm not sure what the current number is. There's a lot of deaths, unfortunately, and then there are some births, but not enough to really bring that population level any higher as it stands right now.
I see. Was there recently a calf born in the J pod? I thought I heard some good news about that.
Yes, there was. Unfortunately, he did pass away.
Oh no. Do you know what the cause of death was?
I don't know for sure. They didn't find a body or anything. He's just been absent. So, but we're guessing it has something to do with probably malnutrition. That seems to be the case for a lot of these whales.
Bummer. And that malnutrition comes from the lack of salmon availability.
Yeah.
Is there anything this pod can do to adapt to a different food source? Would they ever hunt maybe dolphins like the ETP, or they specialize on the salmon?
They really specialize. Like theoretically, they could, but I don't think they will. They haven't shown any sign of really adapting their diet yet. I think it's just so culturally ingrained in them that they wouldn't even look at a dolphin and think that's food at all. They're just so used to eating salmon. That's what they know. And that's probably all they are going to eat, even if it ends up killing them.
Is there any way forward with increasing those salmon populations in the PNW and maybe removing some of those dams to increase spawning ground of the salmon?
Yes, absolutely. Removal of the dams is critical to saving these salmon populations.
Thank you for answering my questions about that. I actually follow this one influencer, an orca influencer. Her name's Kennedy. I think her Instagram handle's intertitle
Yeah,
Kennedy.
intertidal Kendi. Yeah,
Kendi,
I
yeah.
follow her too. Yeah, she does a lot
Yeah,
of work up in the Pacific Northwest. There are a lot of people that do. I've actually never even seen the Southern residents or gone whale watching up in the Pacific Northwest. So there are a lot of people who know a lot more about those populations than I do. So I kind of have a surface level knowledge when it comes to the people living there. So definitely go seek out people who are actively doing work with those whales.
totally. Yeah, I really like her content. She's always sharing her adventures with seeing orcas. That's where I found out about the calf being born in J-Pod. And I was like, oh, that's so exciting. And I've, seen a lot of her work. And I remember hearing, those numbers are really low, that they hover around, 70 to 80 individuals. And having a calf born in that pod is a big deal. But I'm just so bummed to hear that it, hasn't been seen in a while. So I guess those are the challenges that we face in conservation. And it's not pretty, but it's part of the bigger picture that, we have to talk about, and not just the kind of down side of it, but that there are solutions in place if we remove those dams and, reduce sound pollution and enforce respectful viewing guidelines and educate rather than spreading misinformation. And so glad we unpacked all of that in this episode. So, Nicole, we usually ask this question in the beginning of every episode, but we really dove right into it with all of your experience aboard the whale watching boat as a naturalist. But I'd love to know, what childhood memories sparked your excitement and passion for studying orcas?
So, growing up in San Diego my whole life, I was taken to SeaWorld San Diego with some regularity. As a little kid, I didn't really care. I think I probably just wanted to play on the playground. Don't have many memories of that at all. And then my mom kind of stopped taking me for a long time. And then in 2015, I believe, she randomly signed me up for one of their summer camps. So I did that. And that's when I absolutely fell head over heels in love with orcas. Quickly decided I wanted to work with them in the wild instead. And after that, it was just head first, everything orca, doing everything I could to get out on the water with them in the wild.
Wow, so you had that kind of captive learning experience with orcas at SeaWorld here in San Diego. What did the SeaWorld camp entail? For our listeners tuning in who maybe have children of their own one day and want their kids enrolled in the camp, what does that look like?
It was a resident camp, I believe. So we spent the night in building for about a week and just kind of toured behind the scenes of the facility. It was quite a few years ago, so I don't have the clearest memories, but yeah, go behind the scenes, all the different animal habitats, learn about conservation, the rescue team, learn about all the animals individually. So, definitely a fun experience for a kid. very expensive. I don't know if I'd recommend it based on that alone, but also wherever you stand on the issue would definitely influence your choice to send your kids there or not.
You mentioned issues associated with attending a camp like that and seeing marine mammals in captivity. Did that experience deter you? Well, clearly, if you want to see them in wild, it deterred you, but why didn't you want to study them in captivity? Was there something about that childhood experience that made you feel like seeing them in captivity was wrong? Where do you stand on the topic of blackfish in relation to your experience studying them in captivity as a child?
Yeah, it's a very delicate topic that I want to approach delicately. Lots of different opinions everywhere. First of all, I just want to say that wherever you stand, I'm sure it is because you care about the welfare of these animals. And I do too. I think we all do. And that's the most important thing. As far as where I stand on the issue of captivity, it's complicated. I've had lots of experiences at SeaWorld San Diego. I have not been to any other facilities that house killer whales. And personally, having so much experience with them out in the wild, seeing them in their natural habitat, I do not believe that a zoological facility can properly recreate the natural habitat that would be needed for them to fully thrive. I don't think it could ever be a suitable environment. However, on the flip side, I can attest to the care that these whales get from their animal care staff, their behaviorists. When I think about SeaWorld, I think about it as two completely separate entities. There is the corporate side, people who want to build roller coasters and make money off these animals, the ones who are unfortunately making all the decisions when it comes to these parks. And then there's the actual animal care staff who are one-on-one with these animals, responsible for keeping them happy, well-fed, and all of that. So two very different SeaWorlds. I completely stand behind the trainers and the animal care staff who are working as hard as possible to give these animals the best quality of life that they can. And I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time really behind the scenes with them. They're all such incredible people. They really have these animals' best interest at heart, and they do everything they can despite the corporate side making it very, very difficult. So while I don't overall support the keeping of intelligent marine mammals in captivity, I can attest to the fact that at least at SeaWorld San Diego, the whales are not suffering. They do not have a bad quality of life. From what I've seen, my knowledge of animal behavior and spending so much time behind the scenes, seeing how these animals are cared for and interacting with them. So I feel like you can feel both ways. I'm in favor of captivity being phased out completely. I think orcas in captivity have had their time. There are certainly amazing conservational benefits to people being able to see these animals readily. I mean, that's where I fell in love with them, and I wouldn't be doing what I am now if it wasn't for seeing them there. But in the end, I think for the welfare of the animals, it is time to phase out the keeping of orcas in captivity. But again, just because I feel that way does not mean I think these animals are being mistreated at this particular facility. There are others that, believe me, I have some issues with. But yeah, so it's a really, really complicated issue. Wherever you stand, just know you want the animals' well-being to come first. And that might look like kind of a contradictory opinion. Visiting one facility, not visiting another. Wanting this facility to be shut down, even though those animals are going to other facilities, just because that facility is better.
Thank you for speaking so eloquently about such a complicated issue, and you really broke it down in a way I think people can understand how complicated it is in terms of, which facility might be caring for the animals better, and that at the end of the day, we really want these animals, their welfare is at the center of our hearts, right? And I didn't know that it was so complicated. There's so many layers to it, but to your point about your overall opinion being that they should be phased out of captivity, why do you think they should be phased out of captivity? It's because, they're highly social creatures and they don't necessarily have that social structure available to them in captivity? Or what are some of the reasons there?
That depends on the facility. At facilities with multiple whales, they definitely do have a social structure. They have a pod, just like they would in the wild, essentially. But then you have some other facilities who have orcas just by themselves, and that is absolutely terrible, in my opinion.
Okay. So certain facilities have just a single individual, whereas other ones might
Yes.
have, multiple individuals so they can get that communication that the structure really is built off of.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's a whole other level of awful when it comes to killer whales that are housed by themselves.
Okay.
Sometimes not even with other animals, sometimes with other species of dolphin.
I see.
As far as why I just feel like they should be phased out, I just feel like the facilities that we currently have are not a truly suitable environment for these animals. And don't get me wrong, the trainers do a lot to make it as suitable as possible, but there's a limit to what you can do, especially when you're not the one in charge of making decisions.
Sure, it's more from the corporate side that might be making those decisions. At SeaWorld San Diego, are there multiple individuals in captivity then?
Yes, so there
Okay.
are 8 killer whales currently there.
Oh, wow. 8 killer whales. What does that look like? I mean, are the tanks huge enough where there's more than one individual in a tank at a time?
Yeah, so there are 5 different pools, comes to about 6 million gallons of water pumped in from Mission Bay.
Oh,
So,
wow.
as far as orca facilities go, it's a larger facility. I think it's not large enough. It's pretty impossible unless you have unlimited money to make it anywhere near large enough. But, compared to some other facilities, they have larger pools.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they have 5 different pools. They can generally choose which ones they want to hang out with, depending on which other whales they want to be with. So, again, they have their complicated social dynamic, and they have to contend with that in a human-made space. So a lot of that is the trainers knowing the animals and knowing their signals like, hey, I want to be in there right now, and open the gate and all that.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for speaking on such a kind of controversial topic. I know it's not easy to peel back all the layers that are involved in something as precarious as keeping orcas in captivity. I don't know if
Yeah,
precarious was
absolutely.
the right word to use, but it does seem
Um,
very questionable for sure. And I agree with you that they probably shouldn't be kept in captivity, just for those reasons of, humans won't actually be able to provide that habitat for these creatures. They migrate through the ocean and they're meant to be in the wilds.
yeah. So again, complicated issue. That could be a whole podcast episode on its own, but
Right.
yeah.
In 2015, you mentioned you had that childhood influence, so to speak, although you were in your mid-teens, which I think is a great testament to how exciting orcas can be and wildlife can be for anyone at any age to really get involved and make a difference, whether or not it was, you know, 5 years old, 10 years old, 25, 35, at any age, at any point in your life, you can take action and get inspired. And now your whole life is dedicated to studying them, and your passion speaks volumes. What is next after you graduate from UCSD, and what are your bigger dreams? Do you want to continue to be a naturalist? And you mentioned getting your PhD. It sounds like there's so much you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So once I get my degree, I will hopefully transition right into the PhD program, get that. And once I get that, I will be fully, well, at least mostly knowledgeable on how to actually properly conduct research in the academic sense, all the way through from getting the data to actually doing the scary math statistics stuff and getting it published. So I'll learn how to do all that, and then I'll be able to get a research permit. I will get a boat one day when I eventually come up with the money for it. And then my plan is to start kind of a whale watching company slash research trip. That way I wouldn't have to be reliant on government funding for my research, which can be shaky at best. So I'd have people come on to see the whales with me, kind of get to participate behind the scenes in the research and all of that, fund the research. And then also I'd still get the opportunity to be sharing the whales with people, because that is my absolute favorite thing. Like, I love being, if I was just on the boat with them by myself, I would have a wonderful, wonderful time. But it just adds that extra something special when I can be sharing the animals I love with other people and getting them inspired too. So that's the plan. Does life ever go to plan? Not really, but we'll see. That's the current trajectory. We'll see where life takes me.
That's a great dream, Nicole. Thank you so much for sharing. It's inspiring to hear that you want to start your own whale watching tour business. I mean, what's stopping you, right? Once you have the credibility, which you already do, even if you didn't get a PhD, but I understand wanting to collect that research and have it go back to the conservation of these animals. And in doing so, you can include a citizen science effort and you really share your passion because it speaks volumes. And I love that for you. And I think there's nothing you can't do. If that's what you want to do, then go for it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, unfortunately, when it comes to the world of killer whales, there's a lot of gatekeeping in the scientific community here. It's really
There
hard for
sure
people to
is.
get into that field. Like, I mean, with science in general, but especially killer whales. They're a very popular animal, so a lot of people want to be in that field. And it's very, very hard. I've encountered it myself. A lot of other people have. It's just really hard to break into the field. People don't want competition, I think, when they're already established, which is unfortunate to me because science is collaborative. We need to be working together for this. Every single person who can join this effort will make it better. So that's another one of my goals. Really, I just want to, once I'm established, I want to make it a better place for younger people to come in and actually get into this field and not to be deterred by the other people who just want to keep it to themselves because, we're the future. So we better get on
Amen.
in there.
Yes, I love that. Thank you for sharing your own experiences with gatekeeping, especially in the academic space, because it can be so cutthroat. And I think it sort of comes back to that lack of funding piece, right? So comes from a scarcity mindset of not having enough funding to fuel your own research and then in parts of that, a lot of that research stays in an echo chamber, and those academic journals oftentimes don't reach a broader audience and it's not very accessible. And so, if it's not accessible, then are we making that connection between academia and conservation management where it can come full circle? And I think that's a major problem in the academic space because of that echo chamber effect and gatekeeping and people not wanting to share information. And it's just not fair. It really isn't. And I'm so happy to hear you speak on that and that you want to create that accessibility for other young people to get involved because you're right. We are the future and we are the next generation of conservationists who will ultimately really make the most impact because we're going to be around for longer than these older
Yes.
scientists who just don't want to let us in. And it's like, what are you threatened by our youth and capabilities to make waves of change because that's what we're here to do. And you can't stop us because one day, Nicole, you're going to have your own tour watching business where you can
Yes.
create opportunities for everybody. And everyone here heard it first.
Yes, all the people who are super excited and really want to start researching killer whales and don't know where to start, they can all come to me and they'll get on my boat and they'll get to meet some whales and learn how to do it. It's like you were saying about just keeping things in academia, if your only exposure to these animals is through a complicated scientific paper with a lot of charts and graphs and data that you don't understand, you're not really going to care about them too much. But if you're on the water there, if you are experiencing them, if you're listening to them breathe, if you're making eye contact with them, you are going to want to protect these animals. And that is the ultimate goal. Care about them, so you will want to protect them.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for joining on today's episode. You are a true planet person, stewarding for orcas and sharing your passion with everybody. It's really special to hear all of your dreams and inspirations and just the stories you have with the ETP population. I mean, what a crazy experience. And that's one that hopefully Coral and I can experience on your whale watching boat one day soon.
Maybe one day. If they come back, I will let you know and try and get you on a boat.
We'll be there. Coral, let's get on that boat for
Oh
sure.
yeah, I'm already there. I love it.
This is great, guys. What a fun conversation. To wrap up, where can we see orcas in the wild?
Well, orcas are found across all the oceans of the world, so technically you have a chance to see them anywhere. But there's places where that chance is like 0.0000001%. If you really want to see orcas in the wild, my top recommendation, if you are in the US/Northern Hemisphere, really, is going to be Seward, Alaska. You can take a boat out through there. I recommend Seward Ocean excursions and Seacor tours. There's some great companies to take you out. If you go mid-May to mid-June, that is peak orca season, you have an extremely good chance of seeing them. Elsewhere, you can go look for them. British Columbia, Pacific Northwest, pretty good rate of seeing them. Monterey Bay in the spring is their orca season. But all those places, it's really hit or miss. I think Seward is probably your best chance to see them. It's always a gamble when you go whale watching. But as far as places I've been to see them, that is my top recommendation.
Awesome. Those are some great recommendations. I know I definitely want to see orcas sometime in the wild, and I would love to get up to Alaska and see them. Seward, Alaska. Good to know. We always like to end on a quote. Do you have a favorite environmental quote that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I was doing some digging before this episode, trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to pick as far as a quote to really encapsulate my message. But I came across this one, which I think really says for me exactly what I want to accomplish with my work with the orcas. And that is, "With knowing comes caring." It's a quote by Sylvia Earle, who's an oceanographer. And I like that quote because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get people to fall in love with these animals so that they will care about their future. And the cool thing is, if you fall in love with the ocean's top predator, in order to protect them, you have to protect the entire ocean, all the way down to the tiniest little bit of phytoplankton. So protect orcas and you'll protect everything.
That is powerful. Sylvia Earle is also a force to be reckoned with and a true trailblazer in ocean conservation. I was hoping you were going to bring her up, and I'm so glad you did, because with knowing comes caring, and that is certainly true for orcas and phytoplankton in the entire food chain in the ocean. As we wrap up, I want to make sure that everybody knows how they can find you and learn more about your research with orcas. Do you have an Instagram handle or a website? And additionally, you mentioned the photo ID book. What are ways that we can access you?
Yeah, so I do have an Instagram. That's nicole.orcinologist, NICOLE.ORCINOLOGIST. Orcinologist, you might be wondering, that's the term for someone who studies orcas. Comes from the scientific name for them, Orcinus orca. Except kind of not, because I made up that term myself, because cetologist, someone who studies cetaceans, aka whales, is too broad. So, it's kind of a made up term, but I'm hoping it'll stick one day. And then if you want to access the catalog for the IDs for this pod of ETP orcas that have been visiting us, I have a pinned post on my Instagram and also a story and a story highlights. You can access it through there. You can also go, I have a tiny URL here. So that's tinyurl.com/ETPIDs, ETPIDs. And yeah, that's a Google Slides presentation. It's not the most professional, but it'll update in real time if I have any new information. I always have a little thing at the top that says last updated, blah, blah, blah. So you can see that everything's up to date.
Thank you for plugging all of your information, and we will be sure to include that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for being here, Nicole, and to everybody listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed that. I can talk about killer whales for hours. So,
which we did do.
Yeah, that's true. So
almost 2 hours.
I could talk about them for more hours. So I really enjoyed that. I hope all the listeners enjoyed learning about them. Come talk to me on Instagram if you have any questions about the whales. I will answer them, and I'll probably give you more detail than you asked for. But yeah, really great experience. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here, Nicole. It was a delight to interview you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Planet People. We are thrilled to have you as part of our community of wildlifers who care about protecting the planet for future generations to enjoy. We hope that by listening to this podcast, you will be inspired to connect with nature and become a steward of the planet by getting involved and taking action with your local community conservation organization. Until next time, stay positive, Planet People. Thank you to my team here at Planet People. This episode was produced by Natalie Jane Sybil, Coral Carson, and Hugh Carr. Edited by Coral Carson. Theme song by Hugh Carr under the artist name Flama. Thank you, team.